In this lecture, we're going to be looking at two theories of crime, really. We're looking at the right and left realists theories. Now, that may seem like I'm kind of condensing two, but both these theories come from a similar viewpoint. So it's easier to look at them concurrently rather than separately, if that makes sense. And we will see links back to other theories that we've already looked at, but they are separate theories in themselves as well. Now, the realist theory, not right realist, the realist theory are different from the other theories that we've looked at in the sense that they see crime as a real problem that destroys communities and undermines social cohesion. They see it as a blight on society, but they also accept that you can't get rid of crime. They accept the fact that there is a certain element of humanity that are just not very nice people. And so instead of trying to eradicate criminality, they are looking to reduce criminality. They also aren't looking at this from either a structural or a interactionist approach. They're kind of looking at it from both, with slightly different leanings depending on if it's left or right. So we will be looking at the realist ideas of crime control and prevention later on in the unit. So this lecture is really focusing on the causes of criminality rather than what to do about it. But we will touch on it a little bit because it does help us to understand the causes. So the right realists are from a conservative, new right kind of viewpoint. So they're kind of at that end of the spectrum. And we will be going back to look, and we will see Charles Murray coming up in this theory. But they are very much of that conservative, pull yourself up by your bootstraps viewpoint that an individual is responsible for their own behaviours and an individual is responsible for their own circumstances. The left realists, on the other hand, come from a more socialist viewpoint, and they are more structural in their ideas, in that they look at social inequality as a cause of crime. And you will see elements of Marxism in here, but again, it's not a Marxist theory, and we'll get to why it's not later. We'll start with the right realist theory of crime, and this is the work of James Q. Wilson. And we will see other sociologists who come into this, but it's kind of he kick-started this application of new right application to criminality. And the key idea for the right realists is that people choose to commit crime. It is not deterministic, it is voluntarist. And that people commit crime, yes, there may be reasons behind it, but they have made that choice. And in order, therefore, to deal with criminality, you need to make that choice unacceptable. Not in just kind of like it will be frowned upon by society, but it needs to be a unpalatable choice. It's not really a choice actually, but more of a kind of the negatives outweigh the positives of the choice. And you do this through control, through containment, and through punishment. And the right realists have three main ideas on what leads somebody to commit crime. So remember, they're not looking at the structural side of things, they are looking at the individual cause of crime. Why is it that an individual chooses to commit crime? And the first idea that they came up with is the biosocial theory. And what this is, and this comes from Wilson and Herrnstein, and before anyone says anything, I have spelt his name correctly, it does have a double R there. And the biosocial theory puts forward the idea that it is a combination of biology and social factors that leads people to commit crime. Now, you'll remember previously we have talked about the MAOA gene and about the brain abnormalities that can lead to people to committing criminal activity. But Wilson and Herrnstein say, well, that's not enough. We know from studies that those in prison for committing crimes have got the MAOA gene mutation, that they do have brain abnormalities, but so do people who are not in prison. And there are people in prison who don't have these issues as well. So there has to be another factor, according to Wilson and Herrnstein, that leads these people to commit crime and not others. And they say it's about socialization. So not only do these people have biological issues that creates a situation that may lead to criminal behavior. So, for example, with the MAOA gene, that may present in aggressiveness, impulse issues, risk-taking behaviors. That in itself is not enough. There also needs to be the social factor of inadequate socialization into society's norms and values. And when these two combine together, it leads to higher probabilities of criminal activity. So what we're seeing here is the lack of again, that blame being placed upon the individual for as they are the cause of their criminality. The next theory comes from our old friend Charles Murray, and here he's talking about the rise of the underclass. Now, to be clear, the underclass refers to people who are dependent upon the welfare state and do not wish to change their situation. So he is saying that those people who are reliant upon benefits, reliant upon the welfare state, but it's not that they are trying to better themselves so they can get off the benefits. They have an attitude of entitlement. The government owes me this lifestyle. The government owes me a living. And what Charles Murray believes is that the crime rates are increasing due to this growing underclass of people who are dependent upon the welfare state. He believes that the underclass fails to adequately socialize their children into the norms and values of society, and in particular the values of work hard and succeed. Instead, they are socialized into a gimme, gimme, gimme type attitude of everything should be done for me, everything, and when it's not, I am allowed to act out. Murray also suggests that the Glorious Revolution of the 1960s, which led to an increase in lone parent families through divorce, through the sexual revolution, rise of feminism, etc., has left families without the adequate role models and adequate agents of socialization to teach children to take responsibility for themselves and take responsibility for their actions. If you remember back to Families and Households, Charles Murray argues that women or mothers are unable to adequately socialize their children into these beliefs, these values of you are responsible for your own actions. The third part of the right realist theory of crime is rational choice theory, and this comes from Cornish and Clark around the 1980s. Sometimes you refer to it just by Clark, sometimes it's Cornish and Clark, it varies, but I believe Clark originally came up with the theory and then Cornish helped develop it, but I'm not 100% sure on that one. So even if you see it referred to just by Clark, you can use Cornish and Clark or just Clark on his own. And the assumption here is that we all have free will, we all have agency over ourselves, and we all have the power of logical reasoning. and rational thought. And what Cornish and Clark argue, therefore, is that criminals have made a rational choice to commit crime. They have perceived the cost of committing the crime compared to the benefit of committing the crime and found that the cost is lower than the benefit. So this can be, the cost could be getting caught, the likelihood of getting caught, the likelihood of going to prison, and everything that comes along with that. The benefit, what they get from that criminal activity. And the right realists believe that the current costs of crime are too low. The punishments are not severe enough, are not strong enough to put somebody off committing crime. And therefore we see the rise in criminal behaviour because people believe that the benefit of committing the crime is much higher than that of the cost. Now, in evaluating this, there's a number of obvious problems with this theory. The first being, it is solely looking at the individual. It is ignoring wider structural causes of crime such as poverty, inequality, racism, etc. But for the right realists, that's irrelevant because their argument is it can't be those structural causes because not everybody who's facing those structural inequalities is committing crime. So therefore it must be down to the individual. Not everyone in poverty is going out and committing crime. Not everybody who's experiencing racism, homophobia, transphobia is going out and committing crime. So the right realists believe they have a legitimacy in ignoring those structural causes. We also have to take into account the idea of rationality. Now, we've all seen those videos of stupid criminals. I mean, they made an entire TV show out of it, of criminals who are just ridiculous in how stupid they are. But the right realists are still assuming there is a rationality there. But we know not all crimes are planned. Not everyone is thinking rationally 100% of the time. Sometimes our emotions can overtake us, and when we are in an emotional state, we don't think rationally, and therefore we don't weigh up the cost-benefit analysis of the act that we're going to take. For example, should somebody come home and find their partner in a compromising position with somebody else, they may have an emotional response that means that they act in a way that is not rational. And therefore, we can't say that every crime is rational. There are criminals who take advantage of an opportunity that appears before them. There is not necessarily a rationality in that. It is an opportunistic moment in their lives that they take advantage of. We also have to consider the contradictory nature of this theory. The fact that it is arguing that we both are slaves to our biology, but at the same time we make a choice. That there is a determinism to criminality, biology, socialization, but we still make a choice. Now, as I said, the right realists do argue that, well, not everybody who's in the same situation responds in the same way, so there must be some element of free will, of agency within the choices that they're making. But it still contradicts itself. It's still saying it's not your fault, but it is your fault. And that really limits the usefulness of the theory. And finally, it ignores corporate crime. Unlike white-collar crime, which is an individual committing crime for their own personal benefit using their employment or using their job, corporate crime could be considered cultural because it is a business that is committing a crime in order to increase its profits. And yes, that can be an individual within that company that's doing this, but there is essentially a culture within that company that is leading to people being involved in this criminality. So this whole theory is ignoring a huge chunk of criminal behaviour. Now, if we move on to the left realists, and this is the work of Jock Young. Now, we have come across Jock Young previously when we looked at the neo-Marxist theory of crime, and we looked at, as he is the Young in Walton, Taylor and Young. But this theory is the polar opposite end of the spectrum to right realism, in that it is arguing that it is social inequality that causes crime. Now, that does sound very Marxist. However, unlike the Marxists, the left realists don't blame capitalism. They blame society in general and say that it is social inequalities, not capitalism, that is causing crime. So they're not saying get rid of capitalism, they're just saying let's try and make society a little bit more equal. So therefore, when they're looking at crime prevention, they're looking at structural changes and social support, meaning that they are looking at how we can change society to make it so that crime is less necessary. Now, again, they're not talking about getting rid of criminal behaviour, not because they see it as functional for society, but they accept, as we've said before, that some people are just not nice people. But by creating these structural opportunities for people in society and creating more of an equilibrium within society, we are going to reduce criminal activity, or the feeling of it being necessary for criminal activity. So they kind of see the causes of crime being interlinked and spiral in nature. Okay. So the first thing that they point out is criminal activity being caused by relative deprivation. And what we mean by this is we're not talking about poverty. We're talking about relative deprivation. And the reason why we are not talking about poverty is W.C. Runciman, who looked at criminality during the Depression and in the 1930s, showed that during the time of the Depression, there was high poverty. We know this. We've studied history through main school. We have a working knowledge of the Depression. But during that time, crime rates actually fell. Possibly because nobody had anything to steal. Nobody had anything, so therefore there was nothing to steal. But crime rates during the Depression fell, showing that poverty cannot be the cause of crime. Instead, what Lee and Young suggest is that as living standards have risen, so has people's feeling of being deprived. And in terms of relative deprivation, where they compare themselves to others and feel deprived compared to what others have. Again, going back to the idea of keeping up with the Joneses. And when people feel like they are deprived compared to others in their social circle, in their socioeconomic group, it leads to resentment and people turning to crime to achieve what they feel they are entitled to. Now, that doesn't mean they're going out stealing. It could be other criminal enterprises, white collar crime, corporate crime, as well as other blue collar crimes, to get the money or to get the necessary means to achieve what they believe they are entitled to. And this kind of links into our next level, which is marginalization. And marginalization means feeling on the outside of the group. So if you remember back, we've talked about this before, but marginalization is an individual feeling. It is a person feels like they don't belong. Ostracization is being forced out. Okay, so in marginalization, groups are people who feel that they don't belong to society, that they're not part of society. and they lack the goals and the organisations to represent their interests. This can lead to greater sense of frustration and resentment amongst people within those groups, and can lead to criminal behaviour, because they either believe that this will improve their situation, or they take the belief of, well, if you don't want me, why should I follow your rules? If I'm not part of your group, if I'm not part of your society, if you don't feel that I belong here, why should I have to follow your rules? And that can lead to greater criminality. And this leads to our final part of the left realist spiral, if you like, of subcultures. And this links back to the work of Cloud and Olin and Cohen that we talked about previously, and particularly their ideas of blocked opportunities and a group's inability to achieve goals through the legitimate means. For left realists, a subculture is a collective response to a problem of relative deprivation. So when you get a group of people who all feel relatively deprived and marginalized by society, they have a common connection, and they kind of come together in a sense of, well, if we're all out, then we'll just create our own little group. And these criminal subcultures subscribe to the goals and values of society, such as materialism and consumerism, but they go about it in their own way. So again, kind of linking back as well to Merton's strain theory. And it's kind of this spiral process that leads to criminal behaviour. So if you deal with the relative deprivation and you deal with the marginalisation, you are then not going to see the formation of these subcultures, which can lead to criminal behaviour. However, again, we're back to our evaluation. Remember, we don't have an answer to the causes of crime. If we did, then criminality would be reduced, we'd have solutions, etc., but we don't. So these are all theoretical and therefore have their problems. The first problem of the left realist theory of crime and deviance is it turns criminals into victims. It's not their fault, it's their circumstances, it's the poverty, it's the feeling of relative deprivation, it's the feeling of marginalisation. So rather than allowing for the perpetrator to take responsibility for their actions and take responsibility for the consequences of their actions, it's excusing them of their actions. Secondly, it's assuming a value consensus. It's assuming that we all want the same things in life and that we all want the same material goods or the material items. We're all into the materialism and the consumerism that society's creating. And we know that that's not true. And we know that that's not true because we have diversity in society. We have diversity of lifestyle, we have diversity of goals, we have diversity in choice. Fourthly, deprivation can't explain all crimes. Now, you may argue anyone can feel relatively deprived, but how does rape or sexual assault or domestic violence deal with feeling relatively deprived? It doesn't. That's a different thing entirely. So we can't use this deprivation as a starting point for all criminal activity. And the biggest problem with this theory is the way that Lee and Young came about their idea. They focused on inner city crime, and it's focusing on blue collar crime. So again, we're forgetting about corporate crime, which this doesn't work. It also doesn't take into account rural crime. Because their focus is on inner city areas, it gives an unrepresentative view of crime, and it makes crime appear a greater problem than it actually is. Because if you take into account the difference in criminal behaviours in rural areas compared to city areas, the theory doesn't necessarily hold up. So that was the left and right realist theories of crime. As I said, we will revisit this when we look at crime control and prevention. but these are what they believe causes crime.